Hey, April.
Yeah, Simon.
What should I serve my gym friends at the beginning of my upcoming banquet?
I don't know, Simon. What should you serve your gym friends at your upcoming banquet?
Muscles.
Oh, healthy.
Muscles. As if anyone could believe I've got muscles. Anyway. Hi, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Eat My Globe, a podcast about things you didn't know about food. And on today's episode, we're going to be looking at the history of festivals, banquets, and feasts. They go back to the beginning of time, and which Alan Davidson, in his Meisterwork, The Oxford Companion to Food, describes as obviously uncountable, which is true. However, we will try to give you some of the most countable ones of the ones we have through history, as well as giving some of our favourite feasts and banquets of the modern day. It's going to be a feast for the intellect that will have you wanting a feast for your body. First, however, we always like to define the words we are going to use so that we are all on the same page. The festival is, as Merriam-Webster describes it, quote, a time of celebration marked by special observances, end quote. Now let's talk about the word banquet. Again, our old pal Merriam-Webster describes this as, quote, a sumptuous feast, especially an elaborate and often ceremonious meal for numerous people, often in honour of a person, end quote. And the Cambridge Dictionary described it as, quote, a large formal meal for many people, often followed by speeches in honour of someone, end quote. These are all good starting points. Merriam-Webster describes feasts as being, quote, an elaborate and usually abundant meal, often accompanied by a ceremony or entertainment, end quote. Alan Davidson, in his aforementioned book, The Oxford Companion to Food, says feasts, quote, apply to a company of, say, 10 to 1,000, end quote, which again gives us a good starting point. Alan Davidson also states that feasts are, quote, a feature of human foodways, which is found in virtually all cultures, end quote. Indeed, around 2010, archaeologists discovered a 12,000-year-old feast from the Paleolithic era in Hilazon, Tachit, in modern-day Israel, where they found remains of butchered 3 aurochs, or giant cattle, and over 70 cooked tortoises. And in 2017, archaeologists in the Shandong province in China revealed pottery and vessels used in banquets from the Neolithic era. During the Shang dynasty in ancient China, which lasted from around 16th century BCE to the 11th century BCE, banquets and feasts were commonplace in the imperial palace, and those parties were apparently wild. China Daily states, quote, with a pool of wine and a forest of hanging meats, men and women chased each other naked, drinking all night, end quote. Yikes. And by the time of the Zhou dynasty, which lasted from the 11th century BCE to 476 BCE, banquets and feasts continued. The Book of Rites of the Zhou dynasty contains history of Chinese governments, cultures, society, and rituals. The Book of Rites, however, were burnt in 213 BCE and recreated by students of Confucius. According to China Daily, the Book of Rites says, quote, when the emperor gives a banquet, there must be 6 cereals and 6 animals for food. the 6 clears for drink, 120 delicacies, 8 dainties, and 120 urns of sauce, end quote. Cereals included rice and wheat. Animals included cow, sheep, pig, chicken, and horse. Drinks included water and wine. Meanwhile, in the cradle of civilization, also known as the Fertile Crescent, which encompasses land bound by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the Mediterranean Sea, banquets and feasts were also occurring. This would be the area of the world that now includes countries such as Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, where ancient communities within those lands formed around the 9th millennium BCE or 9000 BCE. While the word banquet was first used around 1753, one of the early surviving written descriptions about what happens in a banquet was the banquet stele of Ashurbanipal. British archaeologists discovered that this stele, or slab, in 1951 while excavating Nimrud in modern-day Iraq. The king, Ashurbanipal II, who ruled from 884 BCE to 859 BCE, threw a huge celebration in 879 BCE on the completion of his capital, Kulu, or Kala, now known as Nimrud. The king invited 69,754 people to attend the party, which lasted 10 days. The stele describes what the king served at this banquet, which included a lot of food. I'm not going to mention them all because, again, it was a lot, but some of them included, quote, 1,000 fattened head of cattle, 1,000 calves, 10,000 stable sheep, 15,000 lambs, 200 head of cattle, and 1,000 shehu sheep, 1,000 spring lambs, 500 stags, 500 gazelles, 1,000 ducks, 500 geese, 5,000 kurku geese, 1,000 meshuku birds, 1,000 quaribu birds, 10,000 doves, 10,000 sukanu doves, 10,000 other assorted small birds, 10,000 assorted fish, 10,000 assorted eggs, 10,000 loaves of bread, 10,000 jars of beer, and 10,000 skins with wine. End quote. Sounds like my kind of party. And that's just some of them. Like I said, the king served a lot more food like pomegranates, grapes, fruits, and the list just goes on and on. I bet it was a very fun feast. Get it? The extraordinary banquet was not just a huge party. It was to celebrate the creation of what would be King Ashurbanipal's legacy, his new city of Kalu, which residents devoted to him. In ancient Egypt, there was not an exact match to the word banquet. As Professor of Egyptology Salima Ikram notes, quote, closest word in Egyptian is hebi, to be festal or to make a festival, with heb being translated as feast or banquet, end quote. And ancient Egyptians typically drew these banquets on tombs. That's because, as explained by Egyptologist Salima Ikram, quote, inanimate objects, particularly images created for tombs or temples, were believed to contain latent magical powers. What was drawn or etched on stone could later come into being in another cosmos. That is why so many pharaonic works of art show tables piled high with food. Nobody wanted to go hungry in the afterlife. On the contrary, the ancient Egyptians hoped they would enjoy the greatest feast of all in that other realm. End quote. For example, we have the tomb of Nebamun, who was, quote, scribe and grain accountant, end quote. The paintings adorning Nebamun's tomb showed guests seated on chairs, the mark of a VIP, and seated on mats, the mark of the not-so-VIP, being tended with perfumes to wash their hands. The paintings also showed the food at the banquet, which included fruit, beef joints, grapes, bread, figs, duck, wine, and much more. Often, depictions of this heb, or feasts, were dedicated to one or more of the gods. For example, ancient pharaoh Senwoset I had made a stela for his steward Mentuwosa to show his appreciation. The pharaoh had the stela placed in the town of Abydos, where the Egyptian god Osiris had a temple. Mentuwosa's stela included a calf's head, calf's leg, onions, squash, bread, beer, and more. As Professor Ikram notes, quote, the goal was for each tomb to be a beautiful recreation of a person's world in this life. Food, plenty of food, was a key part of that. End quote. Some ancient Egyptians also mummified these feasts, like meat jerky or salted poultry, to bring with them in the afterlife. Apparently, King Tutankhamun's tomb included at least 30 boxes of food provisions. It was probably meat wrap. The ancient Greeks had many other occasions when feasting took place. During the time Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey in the 9th or 8th century BCE, writer Livia Gershon argues that the feasts were intertwined with politics. Yes, food was involved, but by sharing meat and other food, the gift giver established their power. People who attended these feasts were leaders who established policy, engaged in military strategy discussions with other leaders, and of course allies who celebrated military victories. By the 7th century BCE, aristocrats in ancient Greece also engaged in feasts, described as symposium, which Encyclopaedia Britannica says is, quote, an aristocratic banquet, which men met to discuss philosophical and political issues and recite poetry, end quote. However, according to our chum, Merriam-Webster, the term symposium is based on the ancient Greek word symposion, which means, quote, a drinking party that follows a banquet, end quote. Whatever the order of eating and drinking, the symposium was held in a private home, and slave boys served attendees who were restricted to aristocratic men and high-class female courtesans. Guests would talk about politics, some things don't change, philosophy, and read poems. As World History Encyclopedia points out, quote, some were formal philosophical discussions, while other symposia seem to have been nothing more than drinking bouts, end quote. Perhaps the most famous of these symposiums was one described by Plato, an ancient Greek philosopher who lived from around 438 BCE to 347 BCE, who studied under Socrates. In his work, The Symposium, Plato tells the story of a fictional conversation at a symposium between his teacher, Socrates, and others about the god of love. It's a book that everyone should read. So far, we've been talking mostly of banquets and feasts in the ancient world, but the ancient feasts also had festivals. The Great Dionysia was an ancient Greek festival in the honor of the god of wine, Dionysius. During this festival, poets competed and put on plays that were tragedies or comedies. Audiences watched all day, but luckily for them, there were many vendors from whom they could buy food and drink. Apparently, audiences ate sweets during the performance when they thought acting was not good. This is better than whining about acting in honor of the gods of wine. The ancient Greeks also had the Panathenea festival in honor of Athena, the goddess of war. This religious festival included animal sacrifices to the goddess, processions, musical contests, and athletic competitions. Now, moving on to the ancient Romans. If the ancient Greeks had a symposium, the ancient Romans had a convivium. Convivium means, quote, living together or banquet, end quote. For private banquets, respectable female Roman citizens were allowed to attend. These convivia were held in a dedicated dining room known as a triclinium, or a three-couch room, and then food would be brought to the guests. This would include appetizers known as gustatio, main courses known as mensa primae, and desserts known as mensae secundae. Each of these courses was intended not only to feed the guests, but to display the wealth of the people who are throwing the dinner party. According to the Met Museum, quote, popular but costly fare included pheasant, thrush or other songbirds, raw oysters, lobster, shellfish, venison, wild boar, and peacock. Foods that were forbidden by sumptuary laws, such as fattened fowls and sows' udders, were flagrantly consumed at the most exclusive feasts, end quote. And of course, wine flowed freely at these banquets. As Nina Martyris writes in NPR, quote, gastronomy was fetishized and raised to the level of fine art by the Romans, and its apogee was the banquet, end quote. Now, if you want to read more about the Globe podcast episode on dining in ancient Rome, it's a fantastic one. Do go and listen to it. Ancient Romans enjoyed celebrating the festival of Saturnalia. As the name suggests, it is dedicated to the god Saturn. According to Livy, a historian who lived from 59 BCE to 17 CE, it is first brought in around 500 BCE, although some people suggested it had a longer history. Saturnalia was a week-long period of festivities that involved choosing a king known as the Lord of Misrule. Role reversal occurred when masters might become servants or slaves and wear the slaves' felt hats, and of course, feasting. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, the ancient Maya have also been engaging in a lot of festivals, feasts, and banquets. The Maya civilization dates back to 1500 BCE, but probably reached its peak around 250 CE and 900 CE, and its civilization declined thereafter after the Spanish colonizers arrived in the 1500s. The Maya Empire included modern-day southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Today, there are still many people of Maya descent living in those countries. The ancient Maya had a festival for beekeepers, which included much consumption of honey wine. A festival of cacao involved much drinking of wine too, but it wasn't all just wine. Archaeologists have unearthed a place in Palenque, Mexico, as an important dish consumed at ancient Maya banquets. Freshwater crabs. Archaeologists found 1,300 freshwater crab shells in one site alone. That's a lot of crabs. Carlos Varela Scherer, a researcher with Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, explains in a quote to Newsweek, quote, "For the ancient Maya, it was important to hold ritual banquets where food was shared between the participants and the deities." End quote. So that's probably why there are a lot of crab remains, so they could celebrate. And apparently, attendees of banquets are expected to host their own banquets in the future and invite the host. And this obligation to return the favour and to host banquet passes on to their heirs. So the banquet cycle just keeps going. Mind you, because these crabs were found in a palace, the jury is still out whether the common people also consumed crabs. But whatever the ancient Maya served at their banquets, rich or poor, it's a lovely way to keep the party going. Ancient Indians also observed and celebrated many festivals and feasts. Many of these are still taking place now, and I love being in India when they are happening. Let's talk about the one that I absolutely love. Holi is a Hindu festival that is also known as the Festival of Colours. People in India, Nepal, and around the world observe it, but it is enthusiastically observed in northern India. Festivities can stretch out to a whole week, although the main celebration starts with a bonfire the night before the day of Holi. Then, on the day of Holi, people throw powders of different colours at each other, smear people with red powder called gulal, as well as throw water balloons to soak each other with water guns. Traditionally, the powders were turmeric or pastes from plants, but these days they come from dyes. The origins of Holi is thought to date back to the 4th century, and a 7th century play, Ratnavali, also memorializes this festival. Legend goes that a male demon thought he was more powerful than the god Vishnu, but the demon's son favoured Vishnu. So the male demon and his demon sister, named Holika, plotted to kill the son by having Holika throw the son into a fire. But Vishnu saved the son, and Holika died in the fire. Hence, the bonfire the night before Holi. The legend of the day of Holi itself is based on a love story between the god Krishna, who had blue skin, and a milkmaid named Radha, who did not. So Krishna's mother suggested that he smear Radha with gulal, the red powder, and the rest is history. The food at this festival is one of my favourites. Traditional Holi food includes gujia, which is an empanada-like deep-fried sweet dough stuffed with dried fruits. Pua, which is a sweet pancake soaked in sugar syrup. And tandai, a sweet milk drink with spices like cardamom or fennel, herbs like saffron and fruits. Now, I really wish I was back in India during Holi. Fast forward to the 16th and 17th century England, and apparently, back then, the word banquet referred to the sweet course of the meal, while feast referred to the whole meal. Moreover, people ate the banquet or the sweet course in a completely different room, which could even be in the garden or on the rooftops. Queen Elizabeth I, for example, created a short-term banqueting space in Greenwich for the emissary from France and his staff, which was made out of, according to Alan Davidson, quote, boughs and blossoms, end quote. While that does sound lovely, I am just thinking that I feel bad for people who have allergies. And In the mid to late 1800s, banquets would have been served in the service à la Russe style. That is to say that the courses would have been served in order, rather than all put in the table on one go. Before that, dishes were served service à la Française, which was family style. Service à la Russe was considered more cosmopolitan, according to an article in 1876 by Harper's New Monthly Magazine. According to Tasting Table, Russian Prince Alexander Kurakin brought service à la Russe to France in 1810. The prince couldn't stretch his arms to get choice items from the food served family style because his arms were burned in a fire. He decided to have his waitstaff serve each of the dishes on individual sized plates at one time. Now, I'm unsure of the proof of this story, but again, according to Tasting Table, by 1864, Chef Urbain Boubois, what a fantastic name, who was a chef to Prince Olaf of Russia, wrote a book on the advantages of this type of service, and it then became popular in France. From France, it then moved into Great Britain. The order for service à la Russe went from oysters or small crabs to soup, to fish, to one or two entrees, which according to Harper's New Monthly Magazines are de rigueur or proper at this time of the meal. As an aside, I have always wondered why my American chums call the main dishes entrees, as we in England call them main dishes. And as I've researched this episode, now I know why. Good to know. Back to the order of dishes for service à la Russe. The first entree is followed by a roast with vegetables. The second entree is followed by a dish of game. Olives may be palate cleansers by passing them between dishes. Then the table is cleared for the cheese course with bread or crackers. Finally, we come on to the desserts. Hot desserts are served first, followed by, quote, ices, jellies, and meringues, followed by fruit and nuts, end quote. Then men would stay at the table drinking brandy and liqueurs, while women retired to the drawing room drinking coffee, which seems like a vast amount of food, even for me. And finally, let's move on to the United States. Now, there are many feasts, festivals, or banquets that I could mention in the US. However, there is one that's close to the heart of all Americans. Independence Day. July the 4th is the day in which America celebrates its separation from the British Empire. PBS says that, quote, the 4th of July is Americana at its core. Parades and cookouts and cold beer and, of course, fireworks, end quote. Which I just about think sums it up. July the 4th, 1776 was when the Second Continental Congress adopted the 13 colonies' Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. And according to PBS, quote, 1 year later, according to the Library of Congress, a spontaneous celebration in Philadelphia marked the anniversary of American independence, end quote. So the first 4th of July festivities occurred in 1777. More than a century later, in 1870, the US Congress decreed that the 4th of July would be an unpaid holiday for its employees. But it wasn't until 1938 that it became a paid holiday. As I have found out since I've been living here and as an American citizen, this holiday, probably along with Thanksgiving, is something that all Americans hold special. And a lot of that is down to food, which is not grand, but it's certainly America at heart. At various 4th of July parties, I've seen hamburgers, hot dogs, chili, corn on the cob, and so much more. And of course, barbecue. Now, barbecue at parties goes back much further than one thinks. According to the Houston Chronicle on May 27, 1769, even before the soon-to-be United States would declare her independence, George Washington was writing in his journal that he, quote, went into Alexandria, Virginia, to a barbecue and stayed all night, end quote. And barbecues are still going on to this day, whether at 4th of July or any other festivities. So next time you are at a festival or invited to a banquet or feast, remember you are now a part of culture and practices that date back to the Paleolithic era. It's what makes us human. See you next week, folks. Make sure to check out the website associated with this podcast at www.eatmyglobe.com, where we'll be posting the transcripts from each episode, along with all the references and resources we used putting the episodes together, in case you want to delve deeper into each subject. There is also a contact button, so please do let us know if there are any subjects that you would like us to cover. And if you like what you hear, please don't forget to join us on Patreon. Subscribe, recommend us to your family and friends, give us a good rating on your favourite podcast provider. Thank you, and goodbye from me, Simon Majumdar. We'll speak to you soon on the next episode of Eat My Globe, things you didn't know about food. The Eat My Globe podcast is a production of It's Not Much But It's Ours and Producer Girl Productions. We would also like to thank Sybil Villanueva for all her help both with the editing of the transcripts and her essential help with the research.